Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds. Hello everybody, and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today, we are going to continue our American government series by looking at government by the people. Don't forget that there's a link for a fill-in-the-blank worksheet in the description. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize for any mispronunciations ahead of time. I do my best. Okay. Let's take a little journey through the history of voting rights in the U.S., shall we? Once upon a time, around 1789, the only people who could vote were white male property owners. You know, the kind of guys who had more wigs than feelings about inclusivity. Fast forward to today, and most citizens over 18 get a say, thanks to two major trends. One, knocking down old restrictions on voting, and two, shifting power from the states to the federal government. So there was no voting eligibility roulette, depending on where you lived. The quest to broaden voting rights kicked off in the early 1800s. By the mid-1800s, laws had been passed to ditch restrictions based on religion and property. Now nearly all white adult males could cast a ballot. Yay, progress! Then in 1870, the 15th Amendment came along to say, hey, no racial discrimination in voting. But in reality, African Americans still had to deal with voter suppression for almost another century, thanks to things like violence, literacy tests, and the art of gerrymandering, which is basically drawing district lines with the precision of a 5-year-old trying to color inside the lines, except the goal was to limit voting power. Women got their chance to vote in 1920, thanks to the 19th Amendment. Cue the roaring cheers of suffragettes. By 1964, the 24th Amendment decided that taxes couldn't be used as a sneaky way to block voters. Because let's face it, no one should have to pay extra for democracy. Then in 1971, the 26th Amendment said, okay, 18-year-olds, you can vote too. Because if you're old enough to be drafted, you're old enough to have a say in who's running the country. The Civil Rights Movement brought serious pressure for change, and finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave the 15th Amendment some real teeth. The law applied to all elections, local, state, and federal, and blocked practices that had kept qualified voters from casting ballots. Plus, in areas where voter turnout was suspiciously low, the Department of Justice had the power to pre-approve new election laws to prevent any funny business. Though in 2013, the Supreme Court took out that pre-clearance provision, sparking a fresh wave of debate that's still raging today. When the framers of the Constitution sat down to draft the rules, they basically said, you states can figure out who gets to vote, but don't get too crazy with it. That meant the states had some leeway, but couldn't come up with wacky requirements that would break the Constitution or, say, allow only folks with the best haircuts to vote. Nowadays, if you want to vote, you've got to check off 3 boxes. 1. Citizenship, 2. Residency, and 3. Age. If you're an alien, not the cool sci-fi kind, just foreign-born and not yet a citizen, voting is off limits for now. And don't forget, you've got to live in the state where you want to vote. States like a little commitment, so they usually make you hang around long enough to get a feel for the local issues. Just passing through? Sorry, but transients can't crash the voting party. As for age, thanks to the 26th Amendment, if you're 18 or older, the states have to let you vote. They might not let you rent a car yet, but voting is definitely on the table. Now, if you're in 49 of the 50 states, we're looking at you, North Dakota, you also need to register to vote. This gives election officials a handy list of eligible voters, poll books, which they regularly tidy up by purging names of those who've moved on, either from the state or the world. The days of literacy tests and poll taxes are long gone, so no need to bring your reading glasses or spare change to the voting booth. However, if you're in a mental institution or legally considered mentally incompetent, or if you've been convicted of a serious crime, your voting privileges are likely on pause. Sorry, but those are the rules. Millions of Americans can vote, but for some reason, they decide not to. Voter turnout during presidential elections is already like getting people excited about a broccoli buffet. Challenging. But in off-year elections, where Congress is the main event, turnout drops even lower. To make matters worse, Some folks get tired halfway through the ballot and peace out before voting on local races or measures. This is known as ballot fatigue, which sounds like a condition you could catch from standing in line too long. The non-voters often feel like their vote doesn't matter, suffering from a classic case of political efficacy deficiency. They think the government has been hijacked by politicians, lobbyists, and whatever's trending on social media. Experts have studied voter behavior by analyzing election results, polling people, and digging into political socialization, aka how people get their political attitudes. Turns out, a whole bunch of things like income, job, education, gender, age, religion, ethnicity, and even where you live can influence how you vote. For example, men and women sometimes see things differently when it comes to candidates and issues, creating the famous gender gap. Then there are the psychological factors, party loyalty being a big one. Some voters are super loyal to their party and only vote for candidates wearing the right party colors, a habit called straight ticket voting. But lately, there's been a rise in independent voters who like to mix it up. They might vote for candidates from different parties on the same ballot. This adventurous approach is called split ticket voting. It's like the voter version of ordering both chocolate and vanilla at the ice cream shop. While states get to make most of the rules when it comes to elections, the federal government has a few things to say too. For instance, Congress sets the date for presidential and congressional elections, demands secret ballots because nobody wants their nosy neighbor knowing how they voted, and mandates voting machines because nothing says modern democracy like a machine that occasionally jams. Oh, and they also make sure everyone has the right to vote, which is kind of important. A ballot is that magical piece of paper or screen where voters make their selections. Most states schedule their elections for state offices on the same day as national elections, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November during even-numbered years. Because why make things easy when you can add a first Monday puzzle to the mix? For those who can't make it to their polling place on election day, absentee voting is usually an option. Some states also allow early voting, where you can cast your ballot days before the big event, just in case you're feeling particularly decisive that week. There's also this thing called the coattail effect, where a popular candidate running for a big office at the top of the ballot drags other candidates from the same party along for the ride. It's like being the friend who got invited to a VIP party just because you showed up with someone famous. Elections happen within precincts, which are just fancy names for voting districts. The place where you actually vote is called a polling place, located in or near your precinct. Most states use the Australian ballot, and no, that doesn't mean it's upside down. It's printed at public expense, lists all the candidates, gets handed out only at the polls, and you fill it out in secret, so again, no neighbor snooping. Some ballots group candidates by office, while others list them by party, depending on which method of confusion your state prefers. Nowadays, more than half the votes are cast on voting machines or some type of electronic device, which may or may not make you feel like you're in a futuristic sci-fi movie. And if you prefer the comfort of your couch, there's mail-in balloting, where you can fill out your ballot at home and send it back without ever having to put on real pants. Public opinion is basically what happens when a significant number of people start having thoughts about government and politics. It's like trying to get a group of friends to agree on where to eat, but on a much larger Messier scale. Political socialization is how people pick up these ideas in the first place, which happens through a combination of life experiences, education, and probably a few too many conversations at family dinners. Family and school are like the tag team champions of political socialization. Kids absorb attitudes from their parents, whether they want to or not. And schools try to mold students into good citizens who respect the American political system, or at least know what it is. Other influences include your job, race, and the mass media. The media, whether it's newspapers, TV, or social media, is like the megaphone for shaping public opinion, often making you feel informed or just overwhelmed. Peer groups, a fancy way of saying your friends, neighbors, and coworkers, also play a big part. You know how your friend group all seems to share similar views? That's peer pressure in action, but with more voting involved. Then we have opinion leaders, the folks who think they have all the answers. They might be politicians, pundits, or that one person on Facebook who shares way too many articles. These leaders, especially the ones with a public platform, can sway people's views. And of course, historic events, wars, economic crises, surprise pizza parties, can shake things up and influence public opinion as well. Politicians love to say they have a mandate when they win an election, which is basically them saying, "The people totally agree with everything I stand for." But true mandates are rare, and most of the time, it's a bit of a stretch. Meanwhile, interest groups, private organizations trying to influence policy, like to present their views as if they represent the voice of the masses, even though they usually don't represent everyone. Measuring public opinion is tricky business. The most accurate method is scientific polling, which breaks the process into steps like defining the universe, not the one with stars, but the group of people they're polling, picking a random sample, and asking well-crafted questions. Pollsters can even go all out with fancy methods, but no system is perfect. Sometimes polls can create a bandwagon effect, where people start supporting the candidate who seems to be winning, just so they're not left out of the cool crowd. Despite their flaws, polls remain the best tool we have for taking the temperature of public opinion, though sometimes it's hard to tell if they're measuring the temperature or turning up the heat. A medium is just a fancy way of saying a way to communicate, and when you have more than one, you call them media. These days, the American public gets bombarded with info on public issues from various media, which means we're spoiled for choice when it comes to news sources, or overwhelmed, depending on how you look at it. There are 5 big players in the mass media game when it comes to politics. Television still wears the crown, but the internet is making a strong play for the throne. Then you've got the OGs, newspapers, radio, and magazines, still holding their own. Books also sneak in there, reminding everyone that, yes, reading is still a thing. The internet has changed how Americans gobble up news, and thanks to social media, we now have political debates in comment sections with people we've never met. It's also a major tool for politicians trying to rally supporters, or, let's be honest, beg for donations. The media don't just tell us what's happening, they help shape what we care about. In the 19th century, newspapers were like sports teams, and everyone had their favorite. People were super loyal to their political party's paper, and it was a whole thing. But as news went national, that trend faded, until recently, when partisan media made a big comeback with talk radio, online news sites, and cable channels reminding us all that opinions sell just as well as facts. Television especially changed the political game by letting candidates bypass their parties to talk directly to voters. Who needs a political party when you've got TV cameras and can deliver a snappy soundbite that's over before people can change the channel? Of course, media influence has its limits. Most people aren't glued to political coverage, and those who are tend to stick to their favorite outlets. Democrats and Republicans aren't exactly tuning in to each other's campaign rallies. Instead, everyone just sticks to their comfort zones, reinforcing their own views. Because who needs stress, right? An interest group is basically a club of like-minded folks who get together to push their agenda. They might not be planning secret meetings in dark rooms, but they do try to sway public policy, the rules and decisions the government makes. You'll find these groups hanging out at all levels of government, from your local town council to the folks in DC making the big decisions. Now, interest groups and political parties both play the political game, but they've got different strategies. Political parties are like matchmakers. They care about who is running the show. Interest groups, on the other hand, are the nitpickers. They don't care who's in charge, as long as they get the results they want on the issues they care about. People love to argue about whether interest groups are a force for good or just meddling busybodies. On the plus side, they get people fired up about public issues, give them a chance to meet like-minded folks, and they provide the government with useful info, keeping it in check while doing so. Plus, since interest groups often butt heads with each other, they tend to cancel out the more extreme demands. But, of course, not everyone's a fan. Critics say some groups have way too much sway considering how few people they represent. And don't get started on those groups that claim to speak for everyone but barely represent their own members. Oh, and let's not forget, some groups don't always play fair, looking at you shady lobbyists. Chances are, you're already part of an interest group, or three. Most of them are centered around making money: business, labor, and farming. For example, trade associations are like fancy business clubs, while labor unions gather workers with the same gig, think police officers or factory workers. Interest groups have a few tricks up their sleeves to get the public on board. First, they dish out info to make you care about their cause. Then, they polish up their image so they seem like the good guys. Finally, they push their favorite public policies to the front of the line. To make things happen, interest groups can either go for the direct or indirect approach. The direct method is called lobbying, a fancy way of saying they pester public officials until they get what they want. These lobbyists do everything from donating to campaigns to writing speeches and even drafting laws. It's like they're doing half the politician's job. For some groups, like the American Civil Liberties Union, heading straight to court is their go-to move. They'll even file an amicus curiae brief, which is a legal way of saying, hey, we're not technically involved in this case, but we've got opinions. But when interest groups aren't schmoozing lawmakers, they turn to indirect methods like grassroots pressure, which is just a fancy term for getting everyday people to write angry letters, protest, or march in the streets. Oh, and they're not above using a little propaganda to sway opinions, whether the message is true, false, or somewhere in between. Since political parties pick who gets to make the rules, interest groups try to buddy up to them too. Many even create political action committees, PACs, to raise money for candidates who will make sure their interests are taken care of. After all, nothing says, "we care about democracy," like writing a fat campaign check. Okay, in summary, the history of voting rights in the US began in 1789, when only white male property owners could vote. But over time, significant changes expanded access to voting. The early 1800s saw the removal of religious and property restrictions, allowing nearly all white males to vote. The 15th Amendment in 1870 aimed to eliminate racial discrimination in voting, yet African Americans faced various forms of suppression for nearly a century. The 19th Amendment in 1920 granted women the right to vote, and subsequent amendments addressed issues like poll taxes and the voting age. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 enforced voting rights protections, but faced challenges, such as the 2013 Supreme Court ruling that weakened certain provisions. Today, voting eligibility generally requires citizenship, residency, and age, with state-specific registration rules. While the number of eligible voters has grown, turnout remains a challenge, influenced by factors like socioeconomic status and party loyalty. The media plays a crucial role in shaping public opinion and voter behavior, while interest groups seek to influence policy and promote their agendas through lobbying and grassroots efforts. There's also interest groups, but I'm tired, and I'm sure you are too, so watch the interest groups short for that. There you have it, folks. That is government by the people, nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Don't forget to share some interests in the comments down below, and vote for me by going nuts on those like and subscribe buttons. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.